November 14th, 1968. Apple Corps Recording Studios, 3 Savile Row, London, 9:47 in the evening. The hallway outside the main recording studio was narrow and poorly lit, the kind of corridor that was never meant to hold anything important. A folding chair sat against one wall. A side table held a half-eaten plate of biscuits nobody had touched in an hour. The low electrical hum of equipment bled steadily through the walls, and 2 men stood 4 feet apart, neither of them speaking. Then Eric Clapton spoke. He was 23 years old. He had already been called the greatest guitarist alive by people who had spent their entire careers deciding such things. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, which was precisely what made the words land the way they did. "If you know it so well, George," he said, "play it for me right now." 7 words, no raised voice, no theatrical pause, just 7 words, delivered the way a man delivers a fact he considers beyond argument. George Harrison did not answer. His fingers did not move. His jaw did not tighten. His face did something far more telling. It went completely still. The kind of stillness that only settles onto a man when the thing he has been quietly dreading for years has just appeared in front of him, wearing the face of a friend. Neither of them realized that the control room door behind Harrison was not fully closed. The man standing on the other side of it had set his tea down very carefully, trying not to make a sound, and had been listening for 47 seconds. Paul McCartney had heard every word. What McCartney chose to do next would not just define that night. It would quietly reshape the relationship between all 3 men, and echo through every note George Harrison would ever play again. Stay with me, because what unfolds inside this corridor is the story none of them ever told the world, and you need to hear all of it. But to understand why Clapton's challenge landed the way it did, why those 7 words hit George Harrison like a verdict that had already been written, you have to understand the silence that came long before them. For a long moment, Harrison said nothing. He looked down at the guitar in his hands, a 1957 Gretsch Duo Jet, the same instrument he had carried since the Hamburg days when the Beatles were still learning how to be a band in the noise of the Reeperbahn. The neck was warm from his grip. The strings were already tuned. His fingers knew every position on that fretboard, the way a man knows the rooms of a house he has lived in his whole life. But they did not move. Clapton watched him. The moment the words left his mouth, he felt the temperature in the hallway shift, subtle, like a room when someone opens a window in winter. He hadn't meant them as a weapon. He had meant it the way one musician speaks to another, direct and spontaneous, the way you challenge someone you respect because you want to see what they are truly made of. But standing there watching Harrison's face, Clapton heard the words again, the way Harrison must have heard them, and he could not reach back and take them. What made it worse was what Harrison had done to bring Clapton into that building. Harrison had personally gone to George Martin. He had made his case to Lennon, to McCartney, to the entire apparatus of the most famous band on earth. Nobody brought outsiders into a Beatles recording session. That was not how it worked. But Harrison had believed that if Eric Clapton was playing on the track, the others would finally take the song seriously, would finally take him seriously. He had spent 4 years watching his compositions quietly set aside, gently delayed, ranked below whatever Lennon and McCartney brought in that week. This song was different. This session was supposed to change something. And now the man he had gone to the mat for was standing in the hallway asking him to play someone else's music. Not his song, not anything he had written. A Lennon-McCartney riff that George Harrison had been handed and told to learn. This moment did not begin in that corridor. To understand what Clapton's 7 words truly cost Harrison, and why the man listening behind that door chose to say nothing yet, you have to go back 4 years to a press conference in Melbourne, Australia, and the single sentence that planted the wound Clapton had just reopened. Keep watching, because what happened to George Harrison in Melbourne in 1964 is the exact wound that Eric Clapton accidentally reopened in that London corridor 4 years later. You need to understand both. June 18, 1964, Melbourne, Australia, the Southern Cross Hotel. Outside, the streets were beyond anything the city had ever seen. 300,000 people lined the route from the airport, the largest crowd ever assembled on Australian soil at that point in history. Police had given up trying to manage it. The noise was physical, a wall of sound that pressed against windows and rattled doors from a quarter-mile away. Inside the hotel ballroom, the lights were sharp and the photographers were louder than usual. A press conference. Dozens of journalists leaning forward across a long table, flashbulbs firing every few seconds, questions overlapping. Before the previous answer had finished landing, John Lennon sat at the center, easy and quick, the way he always was in rooms like this. Paul McCartney beside him, smiling with that effortless warmth that cameras had been falling in love with since Hamburg. Ringo at the end, content to be wherever the current took him. And George Harrison, sitting at the table, hands folded in front of him, waiting. A journalist leaned forward and pointed his question at the table. Who actually writes the music? Lennon answered first, instinctively, naturally, the way a man answers a question he has never once had to think about. He named himself and Paul McCartney. He said it warmly, without any cruelty, the easy confidence of a man stating weather. Then he added, almost as a footnote, in the offhand tone of someone describing how a room is arranged, that George plays what they give him. No malice, no dismissal intended. Just a fact, spoken the way you speak facts. Harrison smiled for the photographer to his left. He did not flinch, he did not answer. His hands stayed perfectly still on the table in front of him, folded exactly as they had been before the question was asked. But something settled into him in that moment. Quiet, permanent, the way a stone settles into still water and does not rise again. It was not rage. Rage would have been easier to carry. It was something slower than rage and heavier than disappointment. A question that did not demand an immediate answer. One that simply planted itself deep and began to wait. What am I is not the one who composes. What am I if they cannot hear what I am doing? He was the best guitarist in that room. He believed that privately and completely, the way you believe a thing you have never needed anyone to confirm. But in the mathematics of the Beatles, in the world's equation for what this band was, a guitarist was infrastructure. You assumed the wiring in a house. You did not stop to praise it. Harrison carried that question out of Melbourne and onto every stage and into every studio for the next 4 years. He never spoke it aloud. He just kept writing songs and watching them get shelved, kept playing parts he was handed and executing them perfectly, kept waiting for the moment someone in that room would finally hear what he was actually doing. He brought Eric Clapton into that London studio because he believed that moment had finally come. He was right, but not in the way he expected, and the reason it landed differently was standing on the other side of a door that was not fully closed, back to 3 Savile Row on November 14th, 1968, back to the hallway. Harrison had not written While My Guitar Gently Weeps in a studio or a rehearsal room or any of the polished professional spaces the Beatles had been moving through for years. He had written it alone, in his mother's house in Warrington, sitting on the floor with the I Ching open in front of him. The idea was simple and serious. He would open the book to a random page and commit to whatever the first words were. No second-guessing, no reworking. Whatever the book gave him, that was what the song would carry. The first words he saw were about the love that slept while the world around it decayed. He picked up a guitar and did not put it down until the song existed. It was the most exposed he had ever been as a writer, the most personal composition he had ever carried into a room full of other people. And the room had not wanted it, not dramatically. Nobody raised their voice or turned the song down outright. It was quieter and more damaging than that. When Harrison played it in earlier sessions, Lennon and McCartney moved through the run-throughs the way men move through a corridor they have no reason to stop in, present, unhurried, and somewhere else entirely. No edge in their voices, no obvious impatience, just the particular absence that is worse than criticism because it offers nothing to push back against. The song kept getting returned to the bottom of the pile, gently, professionally, the way you handle something fragile that you do not intend to use. Harrison had decided that the problem was credibility, not the song. The song was his best work, and he knew it. The problem was that inside the Beatles, his name did not carry the weight that Lennon's did or McCartney's did when they walked into the studio with something new. So he went and found the one name that could not be questioned. He went to Eric Clapton and asked him to play on the track. If Clapton was on the recording, the song became undeniable. The prestige was currency, and Harrison was spending it deliberately. He had traded in Clapton's name to buy himself a seat at a table he had been sitting at for 6 years without anyone fully acknowledging him. And then Clapton, standing in the hallway before a single note of the session had been recorded, asked Harrison to play a Lennon-McCartney song. Not something, not Here Comes the Sun, not a single bar of anything Harrison had written. Day Tripper, the riff John and Paul had composed on a Tuesday afternoon as a commercial double-A side, fast and intentional and completely theirs. The riff George Harrison had been handed and told to learn and had executed perfectly because he executed everything perfectly and was never once asked how it felt to do that. The request was innocent on its surface, but the Melbourne wound did not hear the surface. It heard the echo underneath. The same echo it had been hearing for 4 years. You play what we give you, George. Now show me. Harrison's grip tightened slightly on the neck of the Gretsch. His eyes stayed down. Then the control room door swung fully open. Paul McCartney stepped into the hallway, tea in hand, face giving away nothing at all. He looked at Clapton. He looked at Harrison. He looked at the floor between them for one long moment, and then he spoke. What Paul McCartney said in that hallway, in fewer than 10 words, was the single most important thing ever spoken between these 3 men. And not one of them repeated it publicly for 32 years. Because what McCartney said next, and what George Harrison chose to do with it, is the reason this story was buried for 3 decades. Stay with me. McCartney did not defend Harrison. He did not challenge Clapton. He did not fill the hallway with the kind of careful diplomatic language that had smoothed over tension inside the Beatles for years. He looked at George Harrison for exactly 1 beat, the kind of look that does not ask permission and does not offer consolation, and said 2 words, then show him. To understand what those 2 words cost Paul McCartney to say, you have to understand what he was carrying into that hallway. He was not an innocent bystander. He was the other half of the partnership that had made Harrison peripheral by design, not through cruelty, but through the simple gravitational force of 2 extraordinarily gifted men who had found each other early and built something so complete that everyone around them existed in its orbit rather than alongside it. McCartney knew this. He had always known it the way you know a truth you have never found the right moment to speak aloud. He was not apologizing in that hallway. He was not compensating for Melbourne or for the 100 smaller moments that had accumulated into Harrison's wound across 6 years. He was doing something simpler and more devastating than either of those things. He was telling Harrison the truth that the band's structure had never allowed him to say directly. I already know what you can do. I have always known. Play. Harrison stood in the hallway and looked at the guitar in his hands. The choice in front of him was enormous and also impossibly quiet. He could deflect. He was excellent at deflecting, had built it into a reflex over years of practice. He could laugh it off. He can say, not now, maybe later, let's just get into the studio. Any of those exits were available to him. Any of them would have been safe. And every single one of them would have confirmed the story that had followed him since he was 19 years old, sitting at a press conference table in Melbourne, with his hands folded and his answer left unspoken. Harrison closed his eyes. His fingers found the strings of the Gretsch, not reaching, not searching, just arriving, the way they always did when he stopped thinking about what other people needed to hear. He began to play. What came out of that guitar in the next 30 seconds was not Day Tripper. It was not anything with a name. And it made Eric Clapton do something nobody in the music world had ever seen him do before. He played without an amplifier. The Gretsch unplugged, unamplified, filling the narrow hallway with nothing but the raw acoustic voice of the instrument and the hands on it. No distortion, no reverb, no studio polish to smooth the edges or fill the spaces. Just wood and wire, and George Harrison playing the way a man speaks when he has finally stopped choosing his words carefully. The melody had no name because it had never existed before that moment. It was not composed, it was released. Every bend carried something that technique alone cannot manufacture. Every note sustained past the point where most fingers would have moved on, held in the air of that corridor until it said what it came to say and not a syllable more. There was grief inside it, but the grief was not heavy. It was the kind that has been lived with long enough to become something close to understanding. Clapton did not move. His hands, which had held a guitar for more years than most musicians had been alive, went completely still at his sides. His chin dropped slightly. His eyes stayed on Harrison's fingers, not studying them, not analyzing them, just watching the way you watch something you were not prepared to see and cannot look away from. When the last note finally dissolved into the hallway hum, the silence that replaced it was a different quality than the silence before. It was not empty. It was full of everything that had just been said without a single word. Clapton looked at Harrison for a long moment. Then he said 4 words, quiet, unhurried, spoken the way a man speaks when he has nothing left to prove and nothing left to perform. I hear you, George. What George Harrison did with those 4 words, and what all 3 men carried out of that building into the years that followed, is where this story finally lands. If this story reached you, hit subscribe, because these are the moments history almost let disappear completely. Clapton and Harrison walked into the recording studio together 15 minutes later. The engineers who were present that night said Harrison recorded his guitar part on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, with a stillness they had not seen from him before. No second takes driven by doubt. No pausing to check whether the room approved. He played it the way a man plays something he has already decided belongs to him, completely, and without asking permission. McCartney never spoke publicly about what he witnessed in that corridor. He returned to the control room, picked up his tea, and let the night continue. He gave Harrison that story entirely and kept none of it for himself. In the years that followed, Clapton and Harrison grew closer than almost anyone in either man's world fully understood. They toured together. They recorded together. In 1979, Harrison joined Clapton on the road, not as a guest appearance arranged by management, but as a friend who simply wanted to be in the room. The Melbourne question, what am I if they cannot hear me, had finally found its answer. Not on a stage, not on a chart, in a poorly lit hallway at 3 Savile Row at 9:47 on a November night. When one man stopped performing for proof and simply played. Eric Clapton heard him. Paul McCartney made sure he had the chance. And George Harrison never needed that kind of proving again.